A black mother's desperate fight to save her child exposes heartbreaking racial bias in healthcare and sparks a movement for justice. The waiting room of the hospital was a stark contrast to the warmth Tanya Williams tried to offer her son, Jordan. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting an unforgiving glare over the rows of plastic chairs and cold linoleum floors. The air was thick with the antiseptic scent of cleaning solutions and the faint undertone of anxiety that seemed to cling to every corner. The distant hum of machinery, punctuated by the occasional call of a nurse or doctor, created a dissonant soundtrack to Tanya's growing dread. Jordan lay against her chest, his small body burning with fever and trembling slightly despite the weight of her arms. His breaths were shallow and uneven, each one a reminder of how fragile he had become in just a few short hours. Tanya's heart pounded fiercely as she fought the urge to panic. She knew that hospitals were supposed to be places of healing and hope, but tonight they felt more like a labyrinth of indifference and cold bureaucracy. She had arrived at the emergency room earlier that evening, driven by an urgent mother's instinct. Jordan's symptoms had escalated rapidly: a persistent cough that racked his tiny frame, a high fever that refused to break, and the terrifying struggle to breathe. Tanya had rushed through traffic with her son in the back seat, calling ahead to ensure they would be seen quickly. But now, as she sat here in the waiting room, hours had slipped by with little more than dismissive nods and the faint promise of being called soon. Her eyes scanned the room desperately, searching for a sign that someone understood the gravity of Jordan's condition. The nurse at the front desk answered phones and typed into her computer with practiced efficiency, her expression detached. She glanced up only briefly when Tanya asked if Jordan could be seen sooner, then returned to her tasks without a word. Tanya swallowed hard, fighting back tears. She was no stranger to the subtle, unspoken barriers that often stood between black patients and timely medical care. Stories from friends, news reports, and even whispered conversations had prepared her for the possibility that her concerns might be minimized or ignored, not because they lacked merit, but because of her skin color. But nothing could prepare her for the cold reality of watching her child's health deteriorate while the world around her seemed indifferent. Jordan coughed violently, his small body jolting with each spasm. Tanya's hands trembled as she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, trying to soothe the burning heat radiating from his skin. His lips, once a healthy pink, now bore the faintest blue tint around the edges, and every breath he took was a struggle. She called out again, voice trembling but firm, to a passing nurse. "Please, you have to help him. His breathing, it's getting worse." The nurse paused briefly, casting a look that was a mix of irritation and exhaustion. "We're busy right now," she said curtly. "If his condition changes, we'll get to him." "But it is changing," Tanya said, desperation bleeding into her voice. "Please, he needs help now." The nurse shook her head and walked away, leaving Tanya feeling more isolated than ever. Other patients in the room glanced her way, some with sympathy, others with discomfort. Yet no one intervened. The weight of invisible judgment pressed heavily on her shoulders. Time seemed to stretch unbearably. Tanya's gaze drifted to the clock on the wall, each tick echoing in the quiet room like a countdown. Jordan's breathing grew more labored, and with every gasp, Tanya felt a growing panic claw at her chest. She tried to calm herself, to stay composed for Jordan's sake, but the fear was relentless. Finally, a doctor appeared, moving briskly through the room. Tanya hurried to intercept him, clutching Jordan tighter. "Please," she pleaded, "my son's condition is worsening. Can you see him now?" The doctor's eyes flicked to Jordan, then back to Tanya with a tired, almost dismissive expression. "We're prioritizing the most critical cases first," he said flatly. "If his condition deteriorates, he will be seen." Tanya's voice dropped to a whisper, laden with anguish. He is critical. The doctor nodded curtly and moved on, leaving Tanya standing alone amid the sea of strangers. Around her, the sterile hum of the hospital continued unabated, indifferent to the quiet suffering unfolding in its midst. Minutes passed like hours, and Tanya felt a sinking realization settle over her. This was more than just a delay. It was a systemic problem, one that turned lives like hers and Jordan's into afterthoughts. The hospital, a place built to heal, had become a battleground, a place where racial bias threatened to determine who lived and who didn't. Jordan coughed again, weaker this time, and Tanya's tears finally spilled over. She cradled him tightly, whispering words of comfort she barely believed. "Hold on, baby. We're going to get through this." As the night deepened, Tanya's struggle became a silent testament to the unseen battles faced by so many. Her fight was not just for Jordan's life, but for recognition, respect, and justice in a system too often blind to the pain of those who don't fit its narrow mold. Tanya's hands trembled as she clutched Jordan close, his small body warm against hers, but growing weaker by the minute. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway flickered faintly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Each step felt heavier, her hope battling the gnawing fear that this visit could change everything. Jordan had been sick since the previous evening, his cough harsh and relentless, his breathing shallow and rapid. Tanya had tried to soothe him through the night, holding him close and whispering soft reassurances. But by morning, his fever soared, and his little chest heaved with every breath. When she arrived at the emergency room, the waiting room was packed with tired faces and anxious eyes, but she barely noticed. All that mattered was her son's suffering. The sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint odor of old carpet hung in the air. The murmur of distant conversations, the beeping of machines, and the occasional footsteps created a soundtrack to Tanya's growing anxiety. The chairs were mostly occupied, some by families clutching their own fears, some by loners lost in their thoughts. Tanya squeezed Jordan's hand gently, feeling the faint pulse beneath her fingers. He was so small, so fragile, and yet so fiercely alive. After what felt like an eternity, the nurse called their name. Tanya gathered Jordan's small hand in hers and followed her down the cold, linoleum hallway to a small examination room. The walls were pale blue, and the metallic table where Jordan was laid seemed cold against his fevered skin. Tanya's heart pounded as she watched the doctor enter, a middle-aged man with a clipped manner, his face unreadable but eyes sharp and assessing. "Tell me what's going on," he said brusquely, glancing briefly at Jordan. Tanya swallowed the lump in her throat. "He's had a high fever since last night. He can barely breathe and the cough won't stop. I'm really worried." The doctor nodded, moving quickly to listen to Jordan's chest with a stethoscope, his face tightening slightly at the faint wheezing sounds. Tanya saw the flicker of concern cross his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He made a few notes on his clipboard, his fingers tapping impatiently. "We need to run some tests, a chest x-ray and blood work," he said shortly. "It's important to find out what's causing this." Tanya nodded gratefully, relief briefly lifting the weight from her chest. Finally, someone was taking her son seriously. But as the nurse wheeled Jordan out of the room for imaging, Tanya caught the doctor's sideways glance, a look she couldn't quite decipher, but which felt heavy with unspoken judgment. She felt exposed, as if under a microscope, and her skin prickled with discomfort. Hours crawled by in an agonizing slow march. The waiting room noise was a distant hum beneath her growing anxiety. Nurses passed with clipped instructions, some offering sympathetic smiles, others barely meeting her eyes. Tanya's pleas for updates were met with vague reassurances and long silences. She felt invisible, like a shadow in a place too busy to notice. Her exhaustion deepened as she rocked Jordan gently in the chair, murmuring promises of comfort and healing. When the results finally came back, The doctor summoned her again. His tone was professional but colder this time, the warmth of earlier concern, now replaced by clinical distance. Your son has pneumonia. It's serious but treatable. We need to admit him to start intravenous antibiotics immediately. Relief surged through Tanya. At last, a clear plan. But then came the hesitation, the shifting gaze as he asked, "Do you have health insurance?" "Yes," Tanya answered firmly, though her heart sank. She knew the question was less about his health and more about paperwork, cost, and barriers she couldn't overcome with love alone. "Without insurance, inpatient care is complicated," the doctor said, voice lowering but filled with implication. Tanya steadied herself. "When will Jordan receive treatment? Please explain the next steps." His eyes flickered away, and his words came clipped. "We'll try to manage as best we can." She fought to keep calm. "Why did it take so long for him to be seen? I waited hours, begging for help." "We're understaffed," he replied flatly. "We prioritize the most critical cases." "But Jordan got worse while waiting," Tanya insisted. "How is that acceptable?" The doctor avoided her gaze. "It's a difficult system." Difficult. The word echoed in her mind. A bitter reminder of how often people like her were sidelined. How often her son's life seemed to weigh less because of the color of his skin. Tears threatened, but Tanya blinked them away. She wouldn't break here, not now. That night, Jordan lay restless in the hospital bed, sweat cooling his flushed skin. Tanya held his hand, feeling the faint warmth beneath her fingertips, clinging to it like a lifeline. Her phone buzzed. It was her sister. Tanya whispered into the quiet room. "They don't see him the way I do. They don't see us the way we are, but I won't stop fighting." Her sister's steady voice soothed her. "You're his voice now." Drawing strength from those words, Tanya settled beside Jordan, her mind a storm of fear and fierce hope. This was more than a hospital visit. It was a fight for dignity and justice in a system that had too often failed people like them. As Jordan's breathing slowly steadied, Tanya vowed she would not let this moment pass in silence. Tomorrow, she would speak out, demand change, because this was just the beginning. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the hospital blinds, casting a pale glow over Jordan's pale face. Tanya sat beside him, her eyes red from restless sleep, but burning with determination. The sterile white walls that enclosed them felt colder now, the hospital's promises of care clashing sharply with the reality she was living. She watched Jordan breathe, shallow and uneven, his small chest rising and falling like fragile waves on a stormy sea. Nurses came and went, speaking in clipped tones, jotting down notes, yet none seemed to share the urgency she felt. Time had slowed to a crawl, and every minute stretched longer than the last. Tanya's heart ached, not just for Jordan's pain, but for the invisible barriers he faced. The whispered comments she overheard, the hurried avoidance of eye contact, the subtle hesitations in staff responses, told a story she had heard too many times before. A story of people judged not by their needs, but by the color of their skin, their economic status, their place in the world. At one point, she asked a young nurse if there was a timeline for Jordan's next dose of antibiotics. The nurse glanced briefly, then said without eye contact, "It should be soon. We're running behind." "Running behind," Tanya repeated, biting back frustration. "How long will it be?" The nurse shrugged, distracted. "I don't know." The words hit Tanya like a cold wave. Her son's life wasn't supposed to be a question mark. Later, a doctor approached, clipboard in hand, his face neutral, but eyes tired. Tanya recognized him as someone new, different from the brusque man from the previous day. "Mrs. Jackson?" he asked. "I'm Dr. Miller. I wanted to check on Jordan's progress." Grateful for a fresh face, Tanya leaned forward. He's still having trouble breathing. The cough is worse and the fever hasn't gone down much. Is that normal? Dr. Miller nodded slowly. Pneumonia can be stubborn, but with treatment, most children improve in a few days. We'll monitor him closely. Is there anything else we can do? Tanya asked, desperation creeping into her voice. He's so young and I'm scared. Dr. Miller met her gaze, a flicker of compassion breaking through his professional demeanor. I understand. We're doing everything we can. But even as he spoke, Tanya saw the limits around them, the constraints of resources, policies, and unspoken prejudices. She felt the weight of an invisible force holding them back. Her thoughts drifted to the stories she'd heard, the news reports about racial disparities in healthcare, how Black patients often received delayed treatment, dismissed symptoms, or were misunderstood, how systemic bias crept quietly into the halls of hospitals, shaping outcomes and lives. Her mind flashed back to last night, the coldness of the doctor's gaze, the silent judgment when she asked questions, the way her concerns were minimized, as if her voice carried less weight. Determined not to let fear silence her, Tanya decided she needed to speak up, for Jordan and for every family who had faced this struggle. She asked Dr. Miller, "Is there a patient advocate I can talk to? Someone who can help me understand what's happening and make sure Jordan's needs aren't overlooked?" He hesitated briefly. "Yes, there's an advocate assigned to this unit. I can arrange for them to meet with you." Relief warmed Tanya's chest. Finally, a chance to make her voice heard. While waiting, Tanya pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages of support from friends and family. But the words felt distant compared to the urgent reality in front of her. Jordan coughed again, weak and rattling. Tanya wiped his forehead with a damp cloth, whispering soft encouragements. When the patient advocate arrived, a calm woman named Lisa with kind eyes and a reassuring smile, Tanya shared everything: the long wait, the dismissive attitudes, the fear that Jordan's condition wasn't being taken seriously enough. Lisa listened carefully, nodding in understanding. "Unfortunately, what you're describing isn't uncommon," she said gently. "We've been working on training programs to address implicit bias among staff. But it's a process." Tanya's hands clenched into fists. "A process that costs lives," she said quietly. Lisa agreed. "It's systemic, but your speaking out can make a difference. I'll help you file a formal complaint and make sure it reaches the right people." Tanya nodded, grateful but frustrated. Change felt slow, too slow for her son who needed care now. Just then, a sudden commotion echoed down the hallway. Tanya's heart jumped as she saw several nurses and doctors rushing toward Jordan's room. Her breath caught when she heard a nurse call out, "Code Blue! Respiratory arrest!" Panic surged as Tanya sprinted after them, the sterile corridor blurring around her. She burst into the room to find Jordan struggling for air, his tiny body stiffening. The medical team worked frantically, their faces masks of concentration and urgency. Tanya's world narrowed to her son's labored breaths and the desperate hope that help would come in time. Minutes felt like hours. Then, slowly, Jordan's chest began to rise and fall more evenly. A nurse turned to Tanya, eyes soft. "He's stable for now." Tanya sank into a chair, trembling. Relief and fear warred within her. That night, as Jordan slept fitfully, Tanya sat by his bedside, determined to fight not just for his recovery, but for justice. She knew the battle was bigger than one hospital visit. It was a fight against a system that had allowed bias to shadow care, risking lives. Her voice, once quiet and hopeful, was growing stronger, a beacon for change that refused to be ignored. The following morning dawned with a fragile hope hanging in the air. Jordan's breathing had steadied, but the memory of last night's emergency still clung to Tanya's mind like a shadow. She sat by his bedside, watching him sleep. So vulnerable, so precious, and yet so caught in the grip of a system that seemed unwilling to protect him fully. Her phone buzzed softly on the bedside table. It was a message from Lisa, the patient advocate. "We've filed your complaint. The hospital administration has been notified. They want to meet with you." Tanya's heart raced. She'd expected pushback, maybe even denial. But the hospital's swift response surprised her. Still, she knew this was just the beginning of a longer battle. Later that day, Tanya found herself in a quiet conference room, facing Dr. Hernandez, the hospital's chief medical officer, alongside Lisa and a few other administrators. The sterile room felt cold, but Tanya steeled herself. Dr. Hernandez began, "Mrs. Jackson, first I want to thank you for bringing your concerns forward. It's important that we hear from patients and families, especially when they feel their care was compromised." Tanya nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you for meeting with me. But I have to be honest. This isn't just about Jordan. It's about a pattern. I've seen how race affects the way patients are treated here and elsewhere. I'm scared that if I don't speak up, this will happen to others." Lisa added gently, "Research shows racial disparities in healthcare are widespread. It's a systemic issue that requires ongoing attention." Dr. Hernandez sighed. "We recognize that. Our hospital is working on training programs to reduce implicit bias, but it's a difficult process. Change doesn't happen overnight." Tanya's voice sharpened. "But it needs to happen now. My son's life was at risk. The delay in treatment, the dismissiveness, it could have cost him everything." The room fell silent. One administrator, a younger man, spoke hesitantly. "We will conduct a thorough review of Jordan's case. If there were failures, they will be addressed." Tanya studied their faces, a mixture of genuine concern and bureaucratic caution. She knew the wheels of institutional change often turn slowly, but her son's ordeal was a spark that could ignite a larger conversation. That evening, Tanya sat beside Jordan, now resting more peacefully, and reflected on the moments that led to this point. She thought about the doctors who had dismissed her, the nurses who had avoided eye contact, the officer of the hospital staff who seemed impatient with her questions. It was a web of small but significant actions that had built a wall around the care her son needed. Her thoughts turned to the stories she'd heard from other Black mothers, stories of being ignored, minimized, or worse, of losing children because their cries for help were unheard. Determined to turn pain into power, Tanya began documenting everything: times of medication delays, staff interactions, responses to her concerns. She reached out to community groups focused on healthcare equity and racial justice, seeking allies who understood the broader struggle. The hospital, meanwhile, issued a statement acknowledging the complaint and promising to investigate. Local media picked up the story, shining a spotlight on the incident and sparking community discussions about racial bias in medical care. Tanya found herself both exhausted and energized by the growing attention. She realized this was no longer just about Jordan's recovery. It was about holding a system accountable and pushing for real change. But not everyone was ready for that. In the days that followed, Tanya encountered subtle resistance, from some hospital staff who avoided her gaze, to whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. She overheard a nurse muttering about troublemakers and noticed the increased scrutiny on Jordan's medical records, as if questioning her narrative. Despite this, Tanya remained steadfast. She met regularly with Lisa, strategizing next steps, preparing for meetings with hospital leadership, and connecting with advocates and lawyers who specialized in civil rights and healthcare law. One afternoon, as Tanya sat in the hospital cafeteria, a woman approached her cautiously. "Mrs. Jackson?" she asked softly. "I'm Angela, one of the nurses. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what you and Jordan have gone through. I've seen things here that need to change and I want to help." Tanya looked up, surprise and relief washing over her. "Thank you, Angela. We need more people like you. Angela nodded. I've started speaking out among the staff. It's not easy, but change starts with conversations. Their exchange was brief but meaningful. A reminder that while systemic issues were entrenched, individuals within the system could be agents of transformation. That night, Tanya reflected on how this incident had shaken her world. What began as a desperate fight for her son's health had evolved into a mission for justice and equity. She understood that progress would require patience, resilience, and the courage to keep pushing against entrenched barriers. Her voice, once silenced by fear and fatigue, was now louder than ever. A beacon for families whose stories, like hers, deserve to be heard and respected. The days turned into weeks, but Tanya's resolve did not waver. The hospital's promise to investigate Jordan's case became a slow-moving process, tangled in paperwork, internal meetings, and cautious statements. Yet, despite the bureaucratic hurdles, the growing community support gave Tanya strength. She began attending local town halls and advocacy group meetings, sharing her story with a wider audience. Her voice carried the weight of a mother's love, but also the urgency of a systemic crisis. Each retelling brought more people forward, recounting their own painful experiences with medical neglect or discrimination. One afternoon, Tanya received an invitation from the hospital to attend a formal meeting with senior leadership and the review board. They wanted to hear her first-hand account. It was a small victory, a chance to confront the system face to face. On the day of the meeting, Tanya entered the sterile conference room with Jordan in tow, now stronger but still fragile. She looked around the table filled with doctors, administrators, and legal advisors. Among them was Dr. Hernandez, who had met with her weeks before. The meeting began with polite introductions and a review of the hospital's procedures. Then, Tanya was given the floor. She recounted the harrowing night at the emergency room, the delays, the dismissive attitudes, the moments when she feared losing her son because her concerns were minimized. She spoke not only of her personal pain, but of the broader pattern of racial bias she believed was embedded in the system. The room grew quiet. Some faces betrayed discomfort, others showed sympathy. Dr. Hernandez spoke next. Mrs. Jackson, your story is powerful and troubling. We've reviewed the case extensively and identified several areas where protocol was not followed adequately. We are committed to making changes. Lisa, the patient advocate, added. We are implementing new training on implicit bias for all staff and increasing transparency in how complaints are handled. This incident has highlighted gaps that we must address urgently. Tanya listened, but kept a cautious tone. Words are important, she said firmly, but actions matter more. I want to see a plan with clear timelines, accountability, and regular updates. The meeting concluded with promises to improve communication with patients and families and to create a task force focused on equity and care. Outside the hospital, Tanya felt a mixture of relief and wariness. Change was underway, but it was slow and uncertain. She was determined to keep the pressure on. Meanwhile, Jordan's health improved steadily, though Tanya knew the emotional scars would linger. She was grateful for every breath he took, but haunted by the thought of what might have happened if she hadn't fought so fiercely. The community's response was overwhelming. Supporters organized rallies, online petitions, and educational events about racial disparities in healthcare. Local media continued to cover Tanya's story, shining a light on a subject often ignored. Yet, beneath the surface, resistance simmered. Some hospital staff bristled at the scrutiny, and Tanya sensed a subtle backlash. She received anonymous calls and messages warning her to stop stirring trouble, but she refused to be silenced. One evening, Tanya met with a group of other mothers who had faced similar struggles. Their stories echoed hers, tales of being dismissed, misunderstood, or mistreated because of their race. Together, They formed a coalition dedicated to advocating for equitable healthcare policies. They called it Voices for Justice, aiming to support families, educate medical professionals, and lobby for legislative change. As Tanya spoke at their first public event, she realized how much power lay in their shared experiences. Their collective voice was louder, stronger, and impossible to ignore. But Tanya also understood the personal cost. The fight for justice was exhausting and fraught with setbacks. There were moments when despair threatened to take over, when the weight of systemic racism felt unbearable. Yet, every time she looked at Jordan, his bright eyes, his resilient spirit, she found the courage to continue. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But she also knew that her son's life had changed not just by the care he received, but by the movement his story had sparked. Change was no longer a distant hope. It was becoming a demand. Months passed since that tense meeting at the hospital, but the ripple effects of Tanya's struggle had only grown. The coalition, Voices for Justice, gained momentum, drawing support from activists, healthcare professionals, and ordinary citizens alike. Their message was clear: no family should ever face the pain and neglect Tanya endured. The hospital implemented the promised changes: mandatory bias training for staff, improved patient advocacy programs, and transparent complaint processes. A new oversight committee was formed, with community representatives invited to participate. Slowly, trust began to rebuild, but the wounds left by years of systemic neglect would take time to heal. For Tanya, the fight became a defining part of her identity. She balanced the demands of advocacy with the needs of her recovering son. Jordan's health steadily improved, but the emotional scars remained, a silent reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. One afternoon, Tanya sat with Jordan in the park, watching him play with other children. His laughter filled the air, bright and free, a stark contrast to the hospital room where his future once seemed uncertain. A nearby mother approached Tanya, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Because of what you did, my family won't have to go through the same nightmare." Tanya smiled, feeling the weight of that simple but powerful acknowledgement. It was for moments like this that she fought, not just for her son, but for every child, every parent who deserved dignity and respect. The media spotlight eventually dimmed, but Tanya's work never stopped. She testified before local lawmakers, pushing for policies that mandated equity in healthcare access and treatment. She worked with medical schools to incorporate cultural competency in their curricula. She trained community health workers to be advocates and allies. But beyond all the meetings and marches, Tanya's greatest victory was the changed hearts and minds she witnessed in small, quiet ways. Doctors who listened more carefully, nurses who showed extra kindness, hospital staff who challenged their own biases. Yet, Tanya knew the battle was far from over. Racial disparities in healthcare were deeply entrenched, woven into the very fabric of society. But her story had shown that change was possible, that when one voice refused to be silenced, it could awaken many others. As the sun set over the city skyline, Tanya stood on her porch, Jordan asleep in her arms. She looked out at the world with cautious hope. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but she was no longer alone. Her fight had become a movement, her pain had become power, and most importantly, her son's life had become a beacon, a reminder that in the face of injustice, resilience and love could light the way forward. Tanya whispered softly, "We're just getting started, Jordan. This is for you, and for everyone who needs a voice." And with that promise, she stepped into the night, ready to face whatever came next.